Don't forget to take it off before you're finished, okay?
You vile creature! What was that?
Someone's here.
I told you to wait! Where is she?
She's gone, Father.
Gone?
The door burst open with a force that shook the old cypress beams of Thornton Hall. And the sound of it, that single violent crack of wood against plaster, silenced everything in the house. The candles in the rear room trembled. The crickets outside went quiet, as if even the Mississippi night understood that something irreversible had just begun. Edward Thornton stood in the doorway, with his chest heaving and his eyes burning with a light that his wife had never seen in them before. Not in 12 years of marriage, not once. He was not a man who lost control. He had built his entire life on the principle that a man of property was a man of composure. But composure had died in that corridor 3 minutes ago, when he heard the words come through the gap beneath the door, soft and urgent and utterly damning. He looked at his wife. He looked at the slave. And then the words came out of him like something tearing loose from deep inside his chest. You have been deceiving me, both of you, and you will pay for every last moment of it. To understand how a man arrives at that doorway, how a family built on land and labor and the brutal economics of the American South reaches that moment of collapse, you have to go back. You have to understand the world that made Edward Thornton and the world that made him desperate enough to do what he did. And if you want to understand any of this, subscribe to this channel, because this is the kind of history that never gets told the way it actually happened. And before we go further, leave a comment below telling us what country you are watching from. We read every single one of them, and it matters to us to know who is on the other side of this story. In the 18th century, the economy of the American Deep South was not built on ambition alone. It was built on water, on heat, and on the bodies of enslaved human beings who had no say in any of it. Along the vast lowland plains of what would become the Mississippi Territory, rice cultivation had transformed wilderness into extraordinary wealth. The crop demanded conditions that were almost impossible for a free man to endure voluntarily. Flooded paddies stretching out under, a sky that offered no shade, temperatures that climbed past 100 degrees before midday, clouds of mosquitoes carrying malaria and yellow fever, and the constant, exhausting labor of maintaining the intricate system of levees and floodgates that made the whole enterprise possible. It was not work that white men did. It was work that enslaved men and women were forced to do under the threat of the lash, under the threat of sale, under the threat of having their children taken from them in the night. The plantation system was not simply an agricultural arrangement. It was a complete social and legal architecture designed to protect the wealth of a small class of white men and to ensure that the people doing the actual work received nothing from it, not wages, not freedom, not even the right to be recognized as human beings under the law. A man who owned a plantation in the Mississippi Territory owned the land, the buildings, the tools, the animals, and every enslaved person on the property. He owned their labor. In many cases, he owned their children before those children were even born. And the value of all of this, the land, the crops, the labor force, was passed down through families from father to son, generation after generation, in an unbroken chain of inherited wealth that stretched back to colonial land grants and forward into futures not yet written. This is the world Edward Thornton was born into. His father had built the original plantation house in 1741, a modest two-room structure that Edward had expanded into the imposing Thornton Hall that now dominated 40 acres of cultivated bottom land along the river. His father had owned 11 enslaved workers. By the time Edward was 50, he owned 63. The rice paddies stretched further every year. The harvest grew larger. The profits flowed north to cotton merchants and south to sugar traders, and into the ledger books that Edward kept in his study with the precise handwriting of a man who measured his life in columns and rows. He had married Rebecca in 1768. She was 20 years old, and he was 47, which was not unusual for the time and place. Marriages among the planter class were alliances as much as they were love affairs, and Edward had chosen Rebecca with the same careful calculation he brought to every decision. She was the daughter of a neighboring family of modest means, good bloodlines. As the language of the era would have it, respectable name, pleasant face, and young enough to give him the one thing his first 2 decades as a plantation owner had not provided, an heir. His first wife, Eleanor, had died of fever in 1761 without giving him children. The years between Eleanor's death and his marriage to Rebecca had been long ones, and Edward had spent them watching his neighbor's sons grow tall and take over their father's fields while he looked out at Thornton Hall and wondered what would happen to it when he was gone. The law was clear on the matter, and the law was merciless. A man without a direct male descendant could leave his property to a wife, but a wife could not manage a plantation alone in the legal climate of the time. The real power of inheritance passed to the nearest male relative, a brother, a nephew, a cousin, or, in the absence of any such person, the estate went through a process of administration that invariably ended with the property broken up and sold to settle whatever debts and claims could be raised against it. Edward had a cousin named George Thornton who lived in Savannah and who Edward had never liked. George was a small man with large opinions and a habit of showing up at family gatherings and appraising everything with his eyes as if he were already taking inventory. Edward knew with absolute certainty that if he died without a son, George would be at Thornton Hall within a fortnight, standing in that study with those appraising eyes. And everything Edward had built would become George's by the operation of law and the indifference of the universe. He could not allow that. He would not allow it. So he had married Rebecca, and they had been happy enough in the way that people of their class and time understood happiness. A comfortable silence at the breakfast table, shared interests in the management of the household, a mutual understanding of their respective roles. Rebecca ran the domestic side of the plantation with quiet efficiency. She managed the household enslaved workers, supervised the cooking and cleaning, kept the social calendar, and hosted the dinners that were essential to maintaining the relationships of the planter class. Edward ran everything outside the house. It was a partnership of convenience that worked perfectly as long as both parties delivered what was expected of them. The problem was that Rebecca, despite 12 years of marriage and every effort both of them had made in the privacy of their bedroom, had not delivered a child. In the first years, Edward had told himself it was only a matter of time. In the middle years, he had begun to worry in silence. By his 58th year, worry had curdled into something closer to desperation. And desperation in a man of Edward Thornton's character did not produce patience. It produced decisions. He began thinking about the problem the way he thought about every problem on the plantation, as a logistical challenge with a practical solution. He had come to believe, after years of watching the enslaved population of his plantation reproduce with what seemed to him to be effortless regularity, that the fault lay with him and not with Rebecca. This was not a thought he was prepared to examine too closely, because to examine it would be to admit a kind of weakness that no man of his class and time could afford to admit. Instead, he translated the thought into action and gave the action a purpose that he could live with. He would use the resources available to him to ensure that Thornton Hall had an heir. He chose Josiah. Josiah was 26 years old, which made him 33 years younger than Edward. He had been born on the plantation to a woman named Celia, who had worked the rice paddies until her knees gave out, and he had grown up doing every kind of labor the plantation required, working the fields in summer, repairing the levees in spring, hauling lumber and mending fences, and doing the 1,000 invisible tasks that kept a plantation functioning. He was known among the other enslaved workers as a man of few words and considerable dignity, which in the context of slavery meant that he had learned to keep his thoughts and feelings entirely hidden from the white people around him because visibility was dangerous. He was also, and this was the fact that had brought him to Edward's attention, exceptionally strong and healthy in a way that was visible from across a field. Edward called Josiah to his study one evening in March of 1779 and told him what was going to happen. He did not ask. He did not explain at length. He simply told Josiah that he would be required to visit the mistress of the house on certain evenings. that he would do what was required of him, and that if he performed this duty satisfactorily, he would receive certain privileges: better food, lighter work, protection from the overseer's attention. And if he refused, or if he told anyone, or if he failed to perform, the consequences would be of a different kind entirely. Edward named those consequences with the flat precision of a man reading from a list. And when he was finished, he dismissed Josiah with a nod and went back to his ledgers. What Josiah felt in that moment, what passed through his mind as he walked back across the yard to the slave quarters in the dark, is not something the historical record preserves, because the historical record was kept by men like Edward and not by men like Josiah. But it is not difficult to imagine the particular kind of horror that settles over a person when they understand that their body is not their own, that the most intimate parts of their existence are subject to the will of another person who has the full force of law and violence behind him. Josiah had no choice. This is the thing that must be understood before anything else in this story can be understood. He had no choice. Rebecca had even less warning. Edward told her over dinner, quietly, as if he were discussing a change in the management of the household budget. He explained his reasoning. He told her it was necessary. He told her it was the only way. He watched her face across the table and saw the sequence of emotions that moved through it. Shock, revulsion, a flush of something that might have been humiliation or rage, or both at once. And when she began to speak, he raised one hand slightly, just a few inches off the table, and the gesture silenced her the way it had silenced her 100 times before in 12 years of marriage. Because that was the other thing that the historical record does not preserve, the daily grammar of power in a marriage like theirs, 1,000 small gestures and silences and loaded pauses that communicated, without a word being spoken, exactly who in that house was permitted to object and who was not. Rebecca did not object, not that night. She lay awake until the early hours of the morning, listening to Edwards, breathing in the darkness beside her and staring at the ceiling and thinking about what she had been told. She turned the situation over in her mind from every angle she could reach, looking for a way out, a way around it, some argument or circumstance that would make it unnecessary. She found none. Edward had not presented it as a proposal. He had presented it as a decision already made, and the machinery of the household was already in motion around that decision in ways she could not reverse. She was 32 years old. She had been raised to obey her father and then to obey her husband. She had no money of her own, no property, no legal identity separate from the man sleeping beside her. The word no was not available to her in any form that would have made a difference. So the first evening came, and it passed, and Rebecca lay afterward in the small rear room of the house that Edward had designated for these visits, and stared at the wall and felt nothing in particular, which was itself a kind of mercy. Josiah had been quiet and careful and had kept his eyes somewhere other than her face. And she had done the same, and it had been brief and mechanical, and when it was over, they had both left the room without speaking and returned to the separate lives that the plantation assigned to them. The second evening was much the same, and then something happened that neither of them had planned for, and that Edward, in all his cold calculation, had entirely failed to anticipate. It was not sudden. It was not dramatic, at least not at first. It was more like a gradual warming, the way the Mississippi spring arrives, not in a single day, but across a series of days, each one marginally less cold than the last, until one morning you step outside and realize without quite knowing what had happened that the season has changed. Rebecca began to notice things, the way Josiah moved, the way he paid attention, not to what she said, they rarely spoke, but to what she needed, anticipating her with a sensitivity that Edward had never shown in 12 years of marriage, and that Rebecca had not known she was missing until she felt its presence. There was something in those evenings that was not what Edward had intended them to be, and it grew in the space between them over the weeks like something living, like the rice in the paddies outside, quiet and insistent and impossible to stop once it had taken root. She told herself it was gratitude. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself a great many things that dissolved one by one as the weeks continued. By the end of the second month, she had stopped telling herself anything at all, and had simply surrendered to the fact that the hours she spent in that rear room were the only hours of her week in which she felt entirely present in her own body. She had not known, truly known, what her body was capable of before these evenings began. Edward had never been a cruel husband, but he had also never been particularly interested in what Rebecca experienced, because the era in which he lived had given him no framework for considering it relevant. What Josiah gave her was something different, an attention that was complete, a responsiveness that left her breathless, a capacity for pleasure that she had never encountered, and that now, having encountered it, she understood she could not go back to living without. This is the point at which the story changes. This is the point at which Rebecca Thornton, who had spent 32 years doing what she was told, made a decision of her own. She was careful about it. She was, in her own way, as calculating as Edward. She understood biology well enough. The women of the pleasure class were not ignorant of such matters, whatever the social conventions required them to pretend. And she knew what she had to do, and when she had to do it, to prevent the outcome that Edward was waiting for. She began to give Josiah instructions, quietly, in the moments just before the necessity arose. And Josiah, who understood the instruction immediately, and who also understood the impossible position they were both in, complied without a word. Month after month, Edward waited. He watched Rebecca at breakfast with those careful eyes of his, looking for the signs he had read about in the agricultural manuals that discussed, in the clinical language of the era, the management of reproduction on a plantation. He saw nothing. Rebecca carried on as she always had, composed, efficient, serene, and gave him nothing to read, no sign, no change. He began to ask, with increasing frequency and decreasing patience, whether there was any news. She told him it was in God's hands. He was not a man who found this answer satisfying. By the 5th month, he was openly agitated. By the 6th, he had begun to pace his study in the evenings, instead of working at his ledgers. And the overseer had reported to him that the master seemed distracted, which was the kind of observation that could cost an overseer his position, and which the man therefore delivered with considerable delicacy. Edward waved him off. He was thinking. He had come to suspect that something was wrong. Not with Josiah, whose physical suitability for the role Edward had selected him for was not in question. Not with Rebecca, who showed every outward sign of good health. Something else. Something he could not name, but could feel in the way a man of his experience felt when a piece of his operation was not functioning the way it should. A vibration in the machinery, a note slightly off in an otherwise familiar sound. He decided to watch. For 3 nights, he stood in the narrow corridor that ran behind the rear room of the house, a corridor used originally for the movement of household servants between the kitchen and the formal rooms, and he listened at the wall. The first night he heard nothing that told him anything. The second night he heard the sounds that the situation produced and turned away from them, because there are things that a man of Edward's particular psychology cannot observe without becoming someone he does not wish to be, and he understood this about himself even in that moment of desperation. But the third night, he waited. He waited past the point at which he would normally have left. He waited through the silence that followed, and in that silence, through the gap beneath the door, he heard his wife's voice. She was not speaking loudly. She never raised her voice. But the corridor was old, and the wood was thin, and the Mississippi night outside had gone still, and every word came through with the clarity of a bell in an empty church. He heard what she said. He heard the instruction she gave. He understood instantly, with the comprehensive, shattering clarity of a man who has been deceived for 6 months by the 2 people he had most completely in his power, exactly what had been happening, and why, and how thoroughly and deliberately he had been outwitted by a woman he had underestimated for 12 years, and a slave he had not bothered to think of as a person at all. His hand found the door handle. What happened next has to be told carefully, because it is the hinge on which this entire story turns, the moment that determined the fate of every person in that house. Edward threw open the door. The candle on the small table by the window shook, but did not go out. Rebecca was on the far side of the room. Josiah stood near the door. Both of them saw Edward's face at the same instant, and both of them understood, in that instant, that they were looking at a man who had passed beyond the ordinary territory of anger into something more elemental and more dangerous. Edward began to speak. He was not shouting, which was somehow worse than shouting. His voice had dropped to a register that Rebecca had heard only twice before in their marriage, both times in moments of consequence, and she knew the register for what it was. The voice of a man who has decided something. He said that he had stood in that corridor and heard every word. He said that he had been lied to for 6 months by both of them. He said that the betrayal was of a kind he had not imagined possible, and that both of them would pay for it in ways commensurate with what they had done to him. Rebecca tried to speak. She composed herself with a speed that was remarkable under the circumstances, and began to offer an explanation, not an apology, because Rebecca was not, in this moment or any other, a woman who apologized easily, but an explanation, a version of events that she hoped might contain the damage. Edward cut her off with a word. One word, her name, spoken in that low register, and she stopped. He turned to Josiah. Josiah had not moved. He stood where he had been standing when the door opened, and his face showed nothing, not fear, not defiance, not guilt, because he had learned in 26 years of slavery that showing anything on your face when a white man was in this state was an invitation to make things worse. And Josiah was not a man who made things worse when he could avoid it. He looked at Edward, and he waited, because waiting was what the situation required, and because there was nothing else available to him. Edward told him to get out of the house. He said it quietly. Josiah left. Then Edward turned back to Rebecca, and he told her to sit down, and she sat, because the register of his voice left her no alternative. And then he told her what was going to happen. He was going to sell Josiah, not to a neighboring plantation, not to anyone within the territory, but south to the sugar plantations in Louisiana, which in the common understanding of the enslaved population of the Mississippi Territory was as close to a death sentence as the law allowed. The sugar plantations chewed through workers at a rate that the rice plantations could barely comprehend. The labor was brutal beyond description. The survival rate was not a thing that planters discussed openly, but that everyone involved in the trade understood perfectly well. To be sold south was to disappear. It was to cease to exist in any form that the people you had known would ever encounter again. He was also going to put Rebecca on a reduced domestic allowance, remove her authority over the household staff, and confine her movements to the house and the immediate grounds of the plantation for a period he would determine based on her behavior going forward. She would continue to fulfill her role as his wife in every particular, and the arrangement with a suitable enslaved man, not Josiah, who would be gone within the week, would continue, because Edward still needed an heir, and the biological reality of the situation had not changed simply because his wife had decided to subvert his purposes. Rebecca listened to all of this. She sat in the chair in the small rear room with the candle still trembling on the table beside her, and she listened to her husband outline the terms of her future. And something happened in her face that Edward saw but could not entirely read, because it was not the expression he expected. He expected tears. He expected pleading. He expected the collapse of the composed exterior she had maintained for 12 years. What he saw instead was something quieter and more difficult to categorize. She looked at him for a long moment when he had finished speaking, and then she asked him one question. She asked him who he was going to tell. Edward did not understand the question immediately. He stared at her. She explained it to him with a patience that, under the circumstances, was genuinely astonishing. She explained that if he sold Josiah under these circumstances, if he removed an enslaved man from the plantation suddenly and under conditions that the other enslaved workers would certainly find conspicuous, and if he simultaneously changed the domestic arrangements in ways that would be visible to the household staff, and if he subsequently introduced another enslaved man to the same role, then the story of what had happened at Thornton Hall would travel. It would travel through the slave quarters to the neighboring plantations, through the networks of gossip and information that the enslaved population maintained with extraordinary efficiency, in the gaps between the lives their owners could see. And from there, it would travel upward into the conversations of the planter class, into the dinner tables and the social gatherings and the parlor rooms, where the reputation of a man was built or destroyed by the word of his peers. She told him that the story that would travel would not be a story about a wife who deceived her husband. It would be a story about a husband who was deceived by both his wife and his slave for 6 months without noticing. It would be a story about a man who could not father a child and who had resorted to extraordinary measures and had been outwitted by the people he considered his property. It would be the kind of story that men told about other men at the edges of parties, with a particular kind of laughter that no amount of land or money could protect you from. It would follow Edward Thornton for the rest of his life and attach itself to his name in the way that certain kinds of humiliation attach themselves, permanently, indelibly, without mercy. She said all of this in the same quiet, measured voice she used when managing the household accounts. Edward sat down. It was the first time he had sat since entering the room. The silence between them went on for a very long time. What happened in the days that followed is where the story reaches its final and most devastating chapter. Because the truth of what occurred at Thornton Hall in the autumn of 1779 did not resolve itself in any of the ways that the logic of the situation seemed to suggest it should. Edward did not sell Josiah immediately. He told himself he was being practical, that he was managing the situation with the same strategic patience he brought to every complex problem on the plantation. He reassigned Josiah to work on the far levee, a distance of nearly 2 miles from the main house, and issued orders through the overseer that the man was to be kept there indefinitely. It was not a solution. It was a postponement. But Edward, for the first time in his adult life, found himself unable to make a decision because every option available to him carried costs he had not previously had to calculate. Rebecca, meanwhile, had undergone a change that was visible to everyone in the household and comprehensible to none of them. She had always been composed. She was still composed, but there was something different in the quality of her composure now, something that had not been there before. It was as if the conversation in the rear room had removed a constraint that she had been carrying for so long she had not known it was there until it was gone. She managed the household with the same efficiency as always. She sat across from Edward at every meal and spoke when spoken to and maintained every external form of the marriage with perfect fidelity. But she had stopped being afraid of him, and Edward, who had never consciously registered that she had been afraid of him before, could feel the absence of it like a change in the pressure of the air. He began to drink more heavily. The overseer noticed. The household servants noticed. The ledgers in the study, which had always been kept with such precision, developed errors that Edward corrected and then made again, as if his concentration had developed a leak that he could not find and therefore could not repair. 6 weeks after the night Edward had opened the door, a letter arrived from Savannah. It was from George Thornton. George had heard, through channels he did not specify, that there had been some difficulty at Thornton Hall, and he wrote to inquire after the health of his dear cousin and his dear cousin's wife, and to mention, in the almost accidentally casual way that George had always had with these things, that he would be traveling through the territory in the coming month, and hoped very much to impose upon their hospitality for a few days, if it were not too inconvenient. Edward read the letter 3 times, and then set it face down on his desk. The situation had an internal logic to it now, and momentum, and Edward could feel it the way you can feel the current of the Mississippi when you stand in it up to your waist. Not violent, not traumatic, just inexorable, pulling in a direction that has nothing to do with where you want to go. Josiah, working on the far levee in the October heat, had said nothing to anyone. He worked, and he kept his thoughts inside himself, the way he had always done. And he waited for whatever was coming, because he was a man who had learned that waiting was often the only form of agency available to him, and that patience, deployed correctly, was its own kind of power. He did not have to wait much longer. The night that everything ended at Thornton Hall came without announcement, as final things often do. It was a Tuesday evening in late October. which meant the rice harvest was complete and the plantation was entering the slower months of the year. And the atmosphere that settles over a southern plantation in those weeks, a particular kind of exhausted quiet, a release of the sustained tension of the harvest season, should have made it a peaceful time. It was not. Edward had been drinking since the afternoon, not extravagantly, not in a way that was visible to the household staff in any shocking way, but steadily, with the methodical quality of a man who is trying to arrive somewhere specific by a particular route. He had the letter from George on the desk in front of him, and the ledgers open beside it, and he sat between them and drank and thought about the distance between the life he had built and the life he now found himself living. And at some point in the late evening, something shifted in him, and he stood up from the desk with a decision fully formed. The way a decision sometimes arrives when the conscious mind has been occupied elsewhere, and the deeper parts of a person have been working without interruption. He walked to the cabinet in the corner of his study, where he kept the weapons. He removed the pistol that he had carried during a brief and undistinguished military service in his youth. He loaded it with the automatic movements of a man who had performed the action many times before. He walked out of the study. He did not go to the rear room. He went to his wife's bedroom. Rebecca was awake. She had been awake most nights since the confrontation in October. She sat up when Edward opened the door, and she saw the pistol in his hand, and she did something that Edward had not anticipated, and that he would not have been able to predict, even if he had tried, because in 12 years of marriage, he had consistently underestimated her. She was not afraid. She looked at the pistol, and she looked at her husband's face, and she said, in the same quiet voice she had used in the rear room 6 weeks ago, that if he intended to use it, he should understand that he would hang for it. Not because the law protected her. The law of the territory provided very limited protection to women in domestic circumstances, and both of them knew it. But because George Thornton was already on his way and would arrive within the fortnight, and if Edward were hanged for murder, the estate would pass to George anyway, and all of it, every acre, every building, every enslaved person, including Josiah, would belong to the cousin with the appraising eyes. And Edward Thornton's name would be attached not to a prosperous plantation, but to a scandal that would last for a generation. Edward stood in the doorway for a very long time. Then he walked back to his study. In the morning, Rebecca sent a message to the far levee through a household servant she trusted. The message was brief and contained no words, only a specific arrangement of objects that she and Josiah had worked out during those quiet evenings in the rear room. In the moments when they had spoken to each other about things other than the purpose Edward had assigned to those meetings. It told Josiah that the time had come to do what they had discussed. What they had discussed in those careful and whispered conversations that Edward had never imagined were happening, because he had never imagined that a slave and a planter's wife could have a conversation about anything at all, was a plan. It was a plan that had grown slowly, over months, from the seed of a possibility that Rebecca had planted, almost without knowing she was doing it. In the third or fourth week of those evenings, when she had realized that what she was experiencing was not simply physical, but was something more complex and more dangerous, and that Josiah was a man of considerable intelligence who had been waiting his entire life for a moment that most enslaved people never got. They had planned for exactly this situation. Not the confrontation with Edward specifically, that had happened sooner than either of them had expected, triggered by Edward's impatience, rather than by any failure of their precautions, but for the situation in which discovery became inevitable and action became necessary. Rebecca had access to Edward's finances in ways that Edward had never bothered to restrict, because it had never occurred to him that she would use that access against him. She had been moving small amounts of money for months, not from the main accounts, which Edward reviewed regularly, but from the household budget, which he never examined in detail, supplementing those amounts with the proceeds from selling off small items of personal property that Edward had given her over the years, and that she had replaced with cheaper substitutes he had not noticed. She had a sum of money hidden in the lining of a trunk in her dressing room that was sufficient for a specific purpose. She had a contact in Natchez, a free black man named Samuel, who operated as a middleman in a network that the people of the planter class would have found entirely incomprehensible because they had never looked at the world from the position that made such a network necessary. Samuel moved people. He was extraordinarily careful and extraordinarily good at what he did, and Rebecca had been introduced to him through channels that are not relevant to the main story, except to say that the worlds that planter class believed were entirely separate were in fact intricately connected in ways that the planters could not see precisely because they were not looking. On the morning after Edward stood in her doorway with the pistol, Rebecca sent the message to Josiah. That evening, Josiah was gone. He did not travel north. The routes north were watched, documented, dangerous in ways that had ended the attempts of 100 men before him. He traveled south, following a route that Samuel had mapped for him, and that took him through the wetlands and the river bottoms where the plantation overseers would not follow on horseback, and then by boat down the river to a junction point outside the territory of the United States, where the law that defined him as property did not operate. He was 26 years old. He left with nothing except the clothes on his back and the knowledge of where he was going and the absolute, bone-deep conviction that he would not be coming back. Edward discovered Josiah's absence in the morning. He sent the overseer to find him. The overseer searched and found nothing. Edward sent to the neighboring plantations. Nothing. He sent word to the slave patrols that operated throughout the territory. They searched. They found footprints in the mud near the river. They found nothing else. Josiah had vanished as completely as if the Mississippi itself had swallowed him. What happened next is the final and most shocking piece of this story. And it is the piece that the official historical record, what little of it survives from this period and this place, comes closest to preserving, because it entered the legal record of the territory, and therefore left traces that can still be found in the archive. Edward Thornton died in February of 1780, 4 months after Josiah's disappearance. The official cause of death, recorded in the probate records of the territory, was listed as a fever of the chest, which was a common enough cause of death in the Mississippi lowlands, and which the doctor who attended him apparently found unremarkable. He was 59 years old. He left no direct heir. The estate passed to his cousin, George Thornton of Savannah, as Edward had always feared it would. Rebecca Thornton received a widow's portion of the estate as required by the prevailing law, a modest income from a portion of the plantation's proceeds. She was 33 years old. She remained at Thornton Hall for 6 months after Edward's death, long enough to satisfy the social requirements of mourning, and then she left. She did not go to Savannah. She did not go to Virginia. She went west, into territory that was still being mapped, into a part of the continent where a woman with some money and no husband and no name that anyone recognized yet could begin again. The fever that killed Edward Thornton was real. It had settled in his lungs in the weeks following Josiah's escape, during the period when he had been riding out in the cold mornings to supervise the search himself, because he would not trust the overseer to understand the full weight of what he was looking for. But the doctor who attended him in his final illness later told, in a private letter to a colleague in New Orleans that was preserved entirely by accident in a collection of papers that ended up in the state archive, that there was something he had not included in his official report. He wrote that the widow, who had nursed her husband through his illness, had been notably calm throughout the process. Too calm, he wrote, for a woman who was watching her husband die. He wrote that he had thought about this for some time afterward, and had not been able to entirely settle it in his mind. He wrote that the herbal preparations the widow had kept at the bedside, which she said had been recommended by a woman in the slave quarters who had knowledge of such things, had been taken away and destroyed before he had a chance to examine them closely. He wrote that he said nothing about this at the time, because he had no evidence, and because the man was already dead, and because the woman had looked at him when he lingered a moment too long in the sick room, with the same quiet and unafraid directness that he imagined she must have looked at her husband. And he understood that there was nothing to be gained and quite a lot to be lost by pressing the matter further. He folded the letter and sent it, and then he never spoke of the matter again. Josiah was never found. There is no record of him after October of 1779. In the archive of what the planter class documented about the people they owned, he ceases to exist at the moment he stepped off Edward Thornton's land. But absence from a record is not absence from history, and the absence of a name in the documents that powerful men created to account for the people they controlled is not evidence that a person did not continue to live, to breathe, to build something in the world out of whatever was available to them. Rebecca Thornton's name appears once more in the historical record, 9 years later, in a land claim filed in the territory that would become Missouri. The claimant is listed as a widow of independent means. The land she claimed was 30 acres of river bottom land, good land, well chosen, the kind of land that a person with an eye for agricultural quality would recognize immediately. She built a house on it. The land records show that she employed a small number of free laborers, which was unusual for the time and the place. There is no other information about her in the archive after that date. 3,000 miles of continent and 9 years of history lie between the woman who sat in that small rear room in the Mississippi lowlands and the woman who filed that land claim, and the distance between them is a measure of what a human being can survive and become when the alternative is to remain what other people have decided they should be. The rice paddies at Thornton Hall were still being worked the year Rebecca filed her land claim, still flooding in spring and draining gold in autumn, still producing the wealth that flowed north and south and into ledger books kept by men who never looked up long enough to see who was actually doing the work. The names in those ledger books changed as the plantation changed hands and changed again. The land remained. The river remained. And somewhere beyond the edge of the map, 3 people who had been caught in the machinery of that world had each found, by different routes and at different costs, something that the machinery had never been designed to give them. The door that Edward Thornton opened in a rage in that October of 1779 had not led where he expected it to lead. It had not led to punishment or restoration or the recovery of his control over the situation. It had led somewhere none of them could have predicted, through violence and deception and fear and a kind of desperate courage that does not get celebrated in the histories that powerful men write about themselves, to an ending that no one planned and that the world they lived in had made entirely, inevitably, catastrophically necessary. And the last thing the doctor wrote in that private letter, the very last sentence before he folded it and sealed it and sent it to his colleague in New Orleans, was this. He wrote that he had never in 30 years of medicine seen a woman sit at a dying man's bedside with such perfect stillness, and that her eyes, when she looked up at him from the chair beside the bed, had contained an expression he could not name then, and still could not name when he set down his pen, except to say that it was the expression of a person who has already made their peace with what they have done, and who does not require anyone else's peace to go along with it. He said he had found it, in spite of everything, the most dignified thing he had ever seen.
Some days feel off, like I'm standing but still falling. A little pain, a little tired, and no one to tell it all to. There are days that feel unsteady, like I'm drifting out of place. Every step just feels so heavy, with a smile I have to fake. A little hurt I keep inside me, a little weight I always hide, and 1,000 quiet worries I've been holding deep inside. There's no one here to tell it to, no one who would understand. So I carry all these feelings like they're slipping through my hands. A little broken, a little lost, trying hard to just get through. All these nights I stay awake with everything I never say to you. I keep walking through the silence, like it's all I've ever known. Every crowded room reminds me how it feels to be alone. There's no one here to tell it to, no one who would understand. So I carry all these feelings like they're slipping through my hands. A little broken, little lost, trying hard to just get through. All these nights I stay awake with everything I never say to you. Maybe one day I'll be stronger, maybe I'll learn how to speak, but for now I keep it buried in the parts of me too weak. There's no one here to tell it to, no one who would understand. So I carry all these feelings like they're slipping through my hands. A little broken, little lost, trying hard to just get through. All these nights I stay awake with everything I never say to you. I'm freezing, I'm bleeding, slowly fading away. But don't worry, I'm fine. The cold has settled in my heartbeat, like winter living in my veins. Every breath feels numb and fragile, every smile just hides the pain. I'm breaking quietly in silence, falling slow without a sound. Yet I keep saying I'm okay, while my world burns to the ground. I'm frozen here, I'm bleeding slowly, dying piece by piece inside. But I still whisper, it's alright, just to keep you from goodbye. I'm shattered, love, but don't you worry, I'll pretend till my last breath. Even while my soul is fading, I'll say everything's okay. Maybe pain just learned to live here, maybe sorrow feels like home. So I wear my wounds like armor and survive them all alone. I'm frozen here, I'm bleeding slowly, dying piece by piece inside. But I still whisper, it's alright, just to keep you from goodbye. I'm shattered, love, but don't you worry, I'll pretend till my last breath. Even while my soul is fading, I'll say everything's okay. If you ever see me smiling, no, it's just my last defense. 'Cause sometimes love means hiding how much you're suffering. No, I'm frozen here, I'm bleeding slowly, dying piece by piece inside. But I still whisper, it's alright, just to keep you from goodbye. I'm shattered, love, but don't you worry, I'll pretend till my last breath. Even while my soul is fading, I'll say everything's okay. It's okay.